G'day everyone, welcome to another CSBP Fertilisers Market Update. I'm Gray Johnston, joined as ever by our Sales, Strategy and Reliability Manager, Ben Sudlow. Hello Ben.
G'day Gray.
Welcome back. It's been about a month since we last caught up in this format, although we do talk socially occasionally in between times. What's happening in the world of global fertiliser? And maybe we'll start with nitrogen, our favourite friend.
Nitrogen's not my favourite friend, Gray. I've always been a soft spot for potassium, but that's another story. Nitrogen, when we last spoke, it was a month ago. That probably was the peak of the urea market, as it's now turned out. If you remember, we were going into a urea India tender. Prices at that point were just over $500 a tonne. They corrected down ahead of the tender to 470. There was a lot of tonnes going to the tender. China came in for the first time for a while, and then it looked like there was going to be more tonnes come in the market over the delivery window, and then prices dropped a little bit further after the tender. So we went down to about $440 a tonne. What's come out after the tender is then Southeast Asia's went down further, Middle East's gone a little bit further, but in the meantime, Southeast Asia's moved back up again towards the Middle East. Egypt, they've moved up slightly in the last week. So month to month or period to period, prices have moved down $90 a tonne. If you look about what the publication was saying then, they were saying, look, maybe prices over this period get somewhere in that range of 400 to 440, and where prices are this week is I think they'll sit right in the middle of that range. So for once, the publication's got it vaguely right.
And putting that in the context then of a sort of a landed urea price in the market that an Australian or West Australian farmer may kind of have some familiarity with compared to, say, what they paid in 2025 season or 2024 season. Can you help us just put that in a bit of context?
Yeah, so when the prices went up, we were thinking that if we were buying now, we were likely to see prices just under $1,000 a tonne, Aussie dollars a tonne. This would retreat now. They're back towards the mid $800 a tonne. Which is still probably a little bit above what many paid in the growing season just gone.
And then that's urea in terms of how that's sort of shaping up and where the global market is positioned. In terms of Flexion, that's clearly a product that's of interest at the moment. We're working through pre-fill volume and making sure that we can get tanks filled up now ahead of harvest and during harvest and then ahead of seeding for next year. How's that global market shaping up?
So when we last spoke, I think Flexion at that point in time was on a kilos of N basis, almost at parity with urea, so which is a very rare situation. So one of two things was possibly going to happen. Maybe they'd revert to the mean, that urea comes down a bit, or Flexion goes up, and what actually happens is urea's come down. They actually have reverted to the mean, so the difference between the two of them now is probably back to where you might traditionally see them be in any sort of normalised market. So look, we're making still and importing a little bit to make sure that we can get the volume out ahead of seeding next year. And probably the key thing is that the supply chain is pretty empty with the big nitrogen use season we've been through. So getting volume in and then out into tanks ahead of seeding looks like a bigger job than what it might be in a normal year, Gray.
Okay, that's clear then on nitrogen. And you talked there about the supply chain being empty. I'm wondering then, as we transition to phosphorus and potash, it's shaping up, fingers crossed, to be a pretty substantial harvest, and that does mean that those nutrients probably have been removed to some reasonable extent in the West Australian wheat belt this year. We're going to need to replace those products this year. How say the phosphate market's shaping up as we really start turning our attention to 2026?
Look, the phosphate prices generally are high. When we last spoke, they were probably at that point hitting what might have been seen as a ceiling, because they've been flat at these high levels for a little bit. In the last month, they've just got a little bit shaky. Some demand coming off in some of the key markets. China had then suddenly put ammonium phosphates back in the market. And if you remember, China is now allowed to export ammonium phosphates through to the 15th of October. So them coming into this short period now has seen a little bit of flurry of supply. But on the other side of that, you've had some continuation of demand. India, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Ethiopia had just come out from a large tender this week. So there's been some degree of support for what has been an additional volume coming into the marketplace. That's the sort of held the market up a little bit, whilst a little bit shaky coming down. On the other side of it, affordability still remains quite challenged. Phosphate prices are high, grain prices in many markets and many grains are relatively low. So how they play out, we don't really know. But the next period up until Christmas, China's likely to come out again in 15th of October. And then you start seeing some of the markets coming up, including the Australian market, importantly having to start importing for season 26 through November, December this year.
And we know that a trend in situations where phosphate prices are elevated compared to historic averages, often that trend can be that people try to defer their purchasing. Of course, then we get into a challenge where you can get really caught short of a nutrient that is required at seeding to put your crop in the ground, and the supply chain just can't catch up if it doesn't get started. So we're in the throes of starting to think about bringing that product in for this year, Ben?
Yeah, we have to now. Our granulation plant starts up in October. We've got to start bringing product in, of course, to run the plant, and then start getting our sheds full back into this year for that main dispatch period in the first quarter of calendar year 26. So, look, we've got to start buying it. I think the key thing is, if prices are high, what does that volume look like, and making sure we've got some confidence around what our customers are going to need, how much has been taken out this year, what are their expectations like in terms of yield for next year, and how much sort of ammonium phosphates are they going to use at these pricing points. We've got to make sure we get that balance right and get the right volume in for next year.
Yeah, and the fleet of CSBP account managers right now are doing as they do every year, engaging with the customers around the state to get their forecasts and their FSAs set up for the coming year. So if you haven't had the opportunity to catch up with your account manager yet, please make sure you're thinking about your requirements for next year and make sure we've got a good record of what your forecast requirements are going to be.
Yeah.
We've rounded off phosphates, I think there, Ben. Turning to potash, how's that market shaping up?
I'll only say one thing, Gray, about potash, because I'm going to go to you. But the one thing on potash, I think, is potash relative to phosphates at the moment are really cheap. The spread between the two nutrients is as significant as it's been for some time. Because if you remember last time, phosphate shot up, potash shot as well. Potassium stayed low, relatively low, and phosphates are up very high. So if we'd expect strong demand for potash, we also expect that products with like our NPKs are going to be in relatively high demand because the K is relatively more affordable at the moment. But Gray, part of the reason we haven't done one of these for the last month, I know you've been over in Canada, having looked through the supply chains of the Canadian potash producers and suppliers, and you were doing close to the key points. Give us an update on what you believe the market's at, the supply chain looks like.
Heading into very dangerous territory here, Ben. I was lucky enough to go and visit Canpotex, the key organisation in Canada responsible for exporting most of the product MOP that comes from Saskatchewan to the world. They're exporting something like 14 to 15 million tonnes a year of MOP. Got to see the underground mining process for that, the rail process, how they get that product across the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific ports or eastwards to the Atlantic ports, and then the very high efficiency port export infrastructure they've got there to get the ships loaded. The key takeaway from that program in terms of potash supply, probably twofold. Similar message to what you just shared. They're very confident that global demand for potash is going to remain strong, particularly in those markets such as Brazil that are just on an incredible train of growth of products that really need potash against some sort of K depleted soils. They have strong confidence in the fundamentals for demand, and then a lot of messages similar to the messages we often share with our customers in our market, which is the supply chain is fragile, the supply chain is complex, and it very much works best and in the best interests of all participants in the supply chain if we can forecast well, plan well, and have good certainty around volumes. They've got mines that are located 1,500, 2,000 kilometres from the coast where they're exporting product. There's only one or two rail lines getting that product from the mine to the coast, and there's a lot of demand for different products on those rail lines. So really the key message that the guys at Canpotex were hammering home with us was just around the importance of getting those forecasts in, and I think that's why they like working with our business in particular as a participant in their market. We partner with them well to get those forecasts together, and then we can all work together to run the supply chain in the lowest cost kind of fashion. I think probably a couple of broader takeaways I took as well, Ben, was more interesting on the, you talked about China and the ammonium phosphate market before. One thing I probably hadn't appreciated was just how much other competing sources or other competing uses of phosphoric acid in the Chinese market are really kind of taking P out of the fertiliser market. We had a great presentation from a fertiliser market analyst at Mosaic who sort of spoke to a figure of around 3 million tonnes of DAP equivalent being taken out of the Chinese fertiliser supply at the moment because it's now going into lithium iron phosphate batteries for electric vehicles. Yeah. And that 3 million tonnes of DAP could go up to maybe 8 million, 10 million tonnes of DAP by the end of the decade in terms of that's how much P, which was previously going into the market for making ammonium phosphates, is now available in the market for making electric vehicles. And sort of I think that's part of the reason why perhaps China has been less involved in export markets in recent times. So that was probably news to me. And then something also I probably should have known, but wasn't quite as close to, was just the extent to which some of these nutrients are subsidised in other markets. They were talking at the moment that in India, consumers would be paying something like $50 a tonne for urea and something like $250 a tonne for ammonium phosphates, given the extreme subsidy provided by the market. And clearly the potash people were very keen to explain that and explain that potash is subsidised less than those other products. So they had a vested interest in explaining that. Yeah, it was interesting to learn about that as well, and learn about all the other key fertiliser consuming markets in the world. So the answer on potash then, Ben, is a lot of conviction out there that it's a nutrient that's going to continue to be important, and of course supply-demand balance is going to lead to where the global market lands.
Great. It sounds like next time around, with that lot of information, we need to switch roles. You can be the non-enthusiast on one side, and I can be the enthusiast on your side.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll keep everyone on tenterhooks waiting for that. And on that bombshell, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you again, Ben, for joining us.
Cheers, Gray.
And thank you all out there in Fertiliser World. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
This podcast is provided as general information only. The content of this podcast is not a recommendation and has been prepared without taking your objectives or circumstances into account. Before acting on the content of this, you should consider its appropriateness to your circumstances and seek independent advice.